consumer bit is fragile. Year-on-year growth numbers are exaggerated by the low base from which we're coming. It's also the case that the geographic nature of the recovery, it has been very much a greater Dublin area story. And obviously the challenge over the next couple of years is to make sure that that recovery spreads to the rest of the country. But looking at, notwithstanding those caveats, looking at the key factors, the key risks, etc., the fragility of the euro area, particularly the Greek situation, which I've spoken about, that will remain a source of uncertainty. A new risk factor that has crystallised over the last few weeks following the election of the Tory government with an overall majority. Cameron committed before the election that if back in power, he would hold a referendum on EU membership by the end of 2017. So he will now have to deliver on that. God only knows, how that referendum might go, because the campaign in the run-up will heavily determine the outcome. I think it's important to point out that the main political parties would certainly favour remaining within the European Union. But having said that, Europe is one area that seriously divides the British electorate. My gut instinct would be that when the vote is held, that Britain will vote to remain within the European Union. But that's my gut instinct rather than a forecast. And I suppose from an Irish policy perspective, we've got to look at, if Britain did exit the system, what would it mean for us? Well, there are negatives and positives. On the positive side, it would mean that Ireland would then become the only English-speaking country within the European Union. And for US multinational investment, that is an important consideration. They want a foothold in the European market. They prefer to operate in countries where they speak English. So Ireland would be the only English-speaking country. So we could actually benefit in terms of foreign direct investment. That's the big positive. Unfortunately, there are more negatives. A key negative, obviously, would be that if Britain were to leave the system, Ireland would then be the only member of the European Union with, not quite, because if you look at Eastern Europe, but Ireland would have a land border with Northern Ireland, a non-member of the European Union. So would that mean that border controls have to go back up and so on? So it could act as a serious distortion to cross-border trade, which would not be good. A second downside would obviously be Britain would not have the same access to the EU market, and likewise EU countries wouldn't have the same access to the UK market, which would certainly do some damage to indigenous exporters in the Irish economy, particularly on the agri-food side. There's also a possibility that outside of the European Union, the Brits may decide to slash their corporation tax rate and to compete much more aggressively for foreign direct investment. That would be a risk factor for us. And I think, another serious risk that you don't hear much about, but in my view, the UK has been a very sensible ally beside Ireland in its negotiations within the EU on various issues, particularly corporation tax in recent years, because let's face it, the whole business culture and economic culture in the UK is very similar to us here, whereas very different to France and Germany. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that outside of the European Union, if Britain were to leave the European Union, it would mean that Ireland has lost a very sensible ally around the table. So that would increasingly isolate us, particularly in the very controversial debate about the corporation tax situation. Government debt levels here are still very high, 110% debt to GDP. We have a lot of personal and SME debt in the system, housing market imbalances, particularly in the Dublin sector, the restoration of a functioning banking sector. Progress is being made, there's still a way to go. Personal sector, as I described, is still pressurised because of the wage developments in recent years, and also because of job losses, and also the increase in the personal tax burden. An election has to be held by April 2016, so we're now in the run-up to an election. If you look at the opinion polls, you would have doubts and reservations about the ability to form a stable government come the election. And when you're in this situation of political instability, there's a danger that you enter into an era of auction politics. because at the end of the day, for politicians, the long run doesn't extend beyond the next election. So we'll start to see policies being introduced solely with a view to getting elected or getting re-elected. So political instability can lead to poor economic policy making. My final point really would be that the economic recovery is real. The economy is moving in the right direction. We're still not at our destination. There's still a lot of work to be done, still a lot of risks and challenges out there. But I can certainly say today I'm more optimistic about Ireland's economic prospects than I have been at any stage over the last 7 or 8 years.